No one in San Geronimo del Valle imagined that spring of 1933 a widow who could barely feed her daughter was about to save the life of the richest man in the entire region, without suspecting that he had voluntarily renounced his fortune to discover whether it was still possible to find true love. For years, Don Benjamin Valderrama had seen how people smiled first at the size of his estate and only afterward at his face. A widower for 8 years, he began to wonder if anyone would be capable of loving the man once he stopped looking like a landowner. Very near there lived Clara Villasenor, a woman who knew all too well the weight of work, absence, and poverty. A widow, mother of a little girl, seamstress, baker, and washerwoman when necessary. A woman who had learned that dignity is worth far more than any coin. She did not know that within hours she would have to make a decision that would change both their lives forever, because that same afternoon she would find a stranger wounded at the bottom of a ravine and would have to decide whether to help a man who seemed to have absolutely nothing, even though she herself had almost nothing to offer. What Clara never imagined was that stranger hid a secret capable of testing her heart, challenging one of the most powerful men in the region, and changing forever the destiny of her small family. If you also believe that a person's true worth never depends on the money they possess, but on what they do when no one is watching, give us a like. Subscribe to Cuentos del Viejo Campo and activate the bell so you can join us in more stories like this one. And now, tell us in the comments, if you found a wounded stranger on the road, would you help him even if you yourself barely had enough to survive? Also tell us from which corner of the world you are accompanying us today. The sun had not yet finished rising over the Sierra de Guanajuato when Clara Villasenor already had her hands plunged in cold water, washing the only good shirt her daughter still had left. Outside the adobe hut, the air smelled of earth wet with dew and of wood burning in some neighboring hearth. Clara did not lift her gaze from the stone wash basin. She did not need to. She knew every crack in those hands, every callus that sewing and the matate had left on her fingers, and she knew that if she stopped to look at them too long, she would end up pitying herself. And that, she had promised herself, she would never allow. Lucia was still sleeping tangled in a patched rebozo, her cheek resting on her arm, unaware that her mother had already been awake for 2 hours, calculating how many loaves of bread she would have to sell that week to complete the rent on the small plot of land where 3 generations of Villasenors had lived. Clara finished wringing out the cloth, spread it over a rosemary bush, and remained for a moment looking at the dirt road that descended from the village toward the fields of the hacienda Los Laureles, that green and golden expanse that stretched as far as the eye could see, property of the richest man in the region, a man with whom she had never exchanged a word and of whom she knew only what everyone in San Geronimo del Valle knew, that he was a widower, that he was fair with his workers, and that for 8 years no one had seen him smile, truly. 3 years had passed since they buried Gregorio, her husband, crushed by a cart loaded with stone in an accident that the entire village still remembered as one of those tragedies that forever marked the calendar of a small community. Clara was then 27 years old and had a 4-year-old daughter who was only beginning to speak clearly. There is no time for complete mourning, because hunger does not wait for a woman to finish crying. She learned to sew better than she already knew. She learned to make the maize stretch in ways her mother had never taught her. And above all, she learned that no one but herself was going to hold up the roof under which her daughter slept. She entered the hut, stirred the fire in the hearth, and put a little water on to boil for the atoll that would be Lucia's breakfast. While she waited, she took from a small wooden chest hidden under her bed the silver thimble that had belonged to her mother and slipped it on her index finger, as she did every morning before beginning to sew, a silent ritual that connected her with the 2 generations of Villasenor women who had preceded her in that same house with that same dignified poverty, with that same determination not to bend before anything. "Good morning, Mama," said Lucia, rubbing her eyes from the rebozo where she had slept. "Good morning, my sky. Come, the atoll is almost ready." The little girl sat beside the hearth, watching her mother with that silent attention that only children who have learned too early to notice when something worries their parents possess. "You're thinking about the rent money again." Clara smiled, surprised as always by her daughter's perceptiveness. A little. But don't you worry about that, Mija. That's grown-up business. When I grow up, I'm going to sew as fast as you, and we're going to have the whole rent paid months in advance. I hope so, my life. I hope so. No one in the village imagined that morning of spring that that same man was about to disappear from his own life. In the main house of the hacienda, Don Benjamin Valderrama adjusted in front of the mirror a worn shirt he had kept for years at the bottom of a trunk, a garment that had belonged to a peon who died years earlier, and that the steward Anselmo Bravo kept out of the habit of throwing nothing away. Benjamin ran his hand over the several days' beard he had deliberately let grow and studied his reflection as one studies a stranger. "Are you sure about this, Patron?" asked Anselmo from the doorway, arms crossed and hat still on, as if with that he could stop what he already knew had no remedy. "I have never been more sure of anything, Anselmo," Benjamin answered without turning. "For 8 years, I have been receiving women who smile on my fortune before they smile at me. Last week, I overheard the Obregon family discussing in church which of their daughters had the best chance of catching me, so they could inherit Los Laureles, as if I were a raffle prize." Anselmo sighed, because he had known his employer since he was a newly married young man, happy, different from the gray man the death of his wife had left behind. "And you think dressed as a peon you're going to find what you're looking for? I think that if someone ever looks at me without knowing I own all this, I will know whether there is still something in me worth looking at." Benjamin took the old horse, a pack animal he had exchanged that same dawn for his stallion, and left the hacienda by the least traveled road, leaving behind 20 years of administration in Anselmo's hands and a complete identity locked away, like one who sheds a coat that has grown too heavy. He did not yet know that that afternoon a storm would throw him into a ravine less than a kilometer from the hut of a widow named Clara Villasenor. Before leaving, however, Benjamin stopped for a moment in front of the portrait of his late wife, Dona Ignacia, which still hung in the main corridor of the Casa Grande. She was a woman of serene gaze, painted by an artist from the capital a few months before her death. And Benjamin, who for years had avoided looking at that portrait with attention, allowed himself that morning to remain in front of it for a long while. "I don't know if what I'm about to do is madness, Ignacia," he murmured as if she could still hear him. "But for 8 years I have been a shadow of what I was with you, and I don't want to die without knowing whether there is still something in me capable of being loved for what I am and not for what I have." The silence of the house was the only answer, but Benjamin left with a different determination, as if those words spoken aloud had sealed a pact with himself from which he could no longer withdraw. Anselmo caught up with him at the main door with a worn leather satchel. "Here, take some food for the road, Patron, and a little money hidden inside in case things get more complicated than you imagine." "I'm not going to touch that money, Anselmo. If I can't survive like any peon of this region, then I don't deserve to call myself a landowner. With all due respect, Patron, you have never had to survive with nothing. You don't know what it is to sleep hungry or to have doors closed in your face just because of the clothes you wear." Benjamin remained thoughtful a moment, recognizing the uncomfortable truth in his steward's words. "Then it's time to learn it, Anselmo. Take care of the hacienda while I'm gone. And if in a month I haven't returned, you already know what to do with the documents I left in the study. A month is a long time to wander alone on the roads, Patron. A month is the least I need to know whether I am still capable of having someone love me without knowing who I am." The storm arrived without warning, as the worst things always arrive in the Sierra Guanajuatans. The sky, which at midday had been a clean blue, closed suddenly with slate-colored clouds. And by 4 in the afternoon the wind was already tearing leaves from the trees and whistling among the stones of the road. Benjamin, who had spent the day asking for work at 2 neighboring ranches without ever giving his true name, urged the old horse along a narrow path that bordered a ravine, seeking shelter before the downpour fell with all its force. He did not succeed. The animal, frightened by a thunderclap that rolled as if it were splitting the Sierra in two, slipped on the freshly formed mud and fell on its side, dragging Benjamin with it. The impact was dry. Benjamin felt a sharp stab in his right leg before the pain spread like fire through the entire limb. He lay among the stones, soaked, with the horse neighing a few meters away and the rain falling on his face with an insistence that was beginning to feel like a sentence. A cart passed. The man driving it looked toward the ravine, hesitated an instant, and went on, urging the mules. 2 riders passed. One of them, seeing the shape lying among the stones, said something to his companion that Benjamin could not hear, but whose tone left no doubt. It was the indifference of someone who has seen too many peons fallen on the roads to stop for one more. Benjamin, who for 20 years had been greeted with the hat by every person he met on his way, understood in that instant, lying in the mud with his legs swelling under the ragged trousers, what it meant to be nobody. The rain did not distinguish between landowners and peons, but men did. And that afternoon the men had left him alone. The sky was beginning to darken when Clara and Lucia were returning from a village fair with a nearly empty basket, except for a little salt and a piece of soap they had managed to buy with what remained of the week's sales. They were walking fast, trying to beat the storm, when Lucia stopped abruptly. "Mama, there's a man lying down there." Clara followed her daughter's gaze toward the ravine and distinguished, between the dusk and the water that was already falling hard, the figure of a man motionless beside a horse that grazed nervously near him. She did not think twice. She went down the slippery path with Lucia, holding her hand, and when she reached the man she verified that he was breathing, that he was conscious but pale, and that the right leg, bent at an unnatural angle, prevented him from moving. "Can you hear me?" Clara asked, kneeling beside him, not caring that the mud soaked her skirt. Benjamin opened his eyes and found through the rain the face of a woman who looked at him without any calculation, only with the direct concern of someone who sees another human being suffering. "I fell," he murmured. "The horse slipped. Can you walk?" "I don't know." Clara wasted no time with more questions. She looked around, calculated the distance to her hut, which was shorter than the distance to any other house in the village, and made a decision that would ask no one's permission. "Lucia, hold the horse's reins. We're taking him to the house." The journey was slow and painful. Benjamin, leaning on Clara's shoulder, who, though not a large woman, supported his weight with a strength that surprised him, forged in years of carrying sacks of maize and bundles of laundry, moved forward. Lucia walked behind, guiding the horse with a seriousness that made Benjamin smile despite the pain, because it reminded him of a determination he himself had lost long ago. They reached the hut when it was already full night. Clara settled Benjamin on the only bed in the house, a wooden cot with a thin mattress stuffed with straw, and lit the hearth to heat water. "Mama, is he going to pay for sleeping here?" Lucia asked in a low voice with that direct innocence only children have. "We don't ask that, my daughter," Clara answered without taking her eyes from the improvised bandages she was preparing with one of her few sheets. "When someone is hurt, first you help him. Afterward you see about the rest." Benjamin, who was pretending to have his eyes closed from exhaustion, heard every word and felt something move in his chest, something he had not felt in years. That night, while the storm continued beating the sheet metal roof, Clara prepared a soup with the little she had, a piece of squash, some aromatic herbs, and the last bit of dried meat she kept for a special occasion. She fed it by the spoonful to the wounded man because the fever was already beginning to rise and his hands trembled. "Thank you," Benjamin said between sips. "You didn't have to do this." "No one has to do anything," Clara answered with that simplicity that at that moment seemed to Benjamin more valuable than any speech he had heard in his years as a landowner. "But one does it anyway, or else what's the point of living in a village like this?" Clara gave Benjamin the bed and lay down on the floor beside Lisa, wrapped in a thin rebozo, listening to the agitated breathing of the stranger while outside the storm turned into drizzle. She did not ask his full name. She did not ask where he came from or where he was going. She only asked before putting out the candle if he was cold. Benjamin, looking at the oxidized sheet metal roof of a hut he had never set foot in during his entire life, understood that he had found, without yet seeking it completely, the first answer to the question that had taken him out of his own hacienda. At some moment in the early hours between the mild delirium of the fever and the exhaustion of the fall, Benjamin remembered the last time someone had cared for him like that, without conditions. It had been Ignacia, months before she died, sitting at his side during a strong flu that kept him in bed an entire week, holding his hand exactly the same way Clara had held his arm while walking toward the hut. The comparison tightened his chest, not with pain, but with a kind of silent wonder at the idea that life, after so long a drought, was still capable of offering him something resembling disinterested care. Near dawn, the fever rose a little more, and Benjamin, between confused dreams, murmured some words that Clara, awakened by the moan, did not fully understand, except a name that seemed to reach her. Ignacia. She asked nothing. She only placed a cool cloth on his forehead and stayed watching until his breathing calmed again. At dawn, when the rain finally stopped completely and the sun began to filter timidly among the gray clouds withdrawing toward the Sierra, Clara went out for a moment to check on the horse that had spent the night tied under an improvised shelter. The animal, now calm, received her with a soft snort, and she, stroking its muzzle, wondered aloud who that man really was who spoke in his sleep with the name of a woman who was no longer there, and what story he carried behind those tired eyes that had looked at her the night before with a gratitude that seemed too deep to belong merely to any peon grateful for a plate of soup. The next morning, with the fever already subsiding, Benjamin observed for the first time clearly the hands of the woman who had helped him. They were thin but strong hands, with the tips of the fingers hardened by needle and thread, with a small scar on the left index finger that spoke of years of sewing late under the light of a candle. They were not the hands of someone who asks. They were the hands of someone who builds, even if only centimeter by centimeter, a life that no one else sustains. And there was something more that Benjamin noticed, something that would call his attention during all the following days. The way Clara moved through her poorhouse with her back straight, with her chin slightly raised, as if scarcity had no right to bend her body, even though it had been trying for years. The days that followed passed with the particular slowness of convalescence. Benjamin, who had introduced himself to Clara simply as Benjamin, without surname, without history, remained in the hut while the leg healed enough for him to put weight on it. Clara never asked more than necessary. She fed him, changed his bandages, and when he insisted on paying her in some way, she limited herself to saying that if he wanted to help, he could carry firewood when he could stand, and with that any account would be settled. Benjamin, who in 20 years of administering the most prosperous hacienda in the region had never carried a bundle of firewood, discovered in those days a form of work he did not know. The work of one who has no other choice. The work that expects no recognition because recognition does not pay the rent. It was on the fourth day, at dawn, when Benjamin saw her truly for the first time without her knowing. Clara had gone out before the sun rose, as every morning, to knead the bread she would later sell in the village. Benjamin, who slept only half because of the pain in his leg, watched her from the curtainless window. He saw her light the clay oven with movements she had repeated since childhood. He saw her shake the flour from her hands with an almost mechanical gesture. He saw her pause an instant with her eyes closed, breathing deeply before continuing, as one who gathers strength for a day that promises to be as difficult as the previous one. There was in her no visible complaint, no self-pity. There was instead a silent determination that Benjamin could not entirely name, something he recognized because he himself had once possessed it before fortune and solitude had gradually stripped it away. That day, without either of them saying it aloud, something changed in the way they looked at each other when they exchanged words. The days became a week, and the week too. Benjamin, leaning on an improvised cane made from a mesquite branch, began to help with whatever he could, carrying water from the communal well, repairing the fence of the small corral where Clara kept two skinny hens, cutting firewood clumsily at first and with growing skill afterward. One afternoon, while Clara finished some urgent sewing for a neighbor, Benjamin found Lucia sitting alone in the patio, drawing clumsy figures in the loose earth with a stick. "What are you doing?" he asked, sitting carefully beside her, still protecting the healing leg. "I'm trying to write my name. The village teacher left last year, and now nobody teaches us the letters. My mama knows some, but she doesn't have time to teach me. Benjamin felt a stab of indignation at hearing that, because on his hacienda, barely a few kilometers away, he had a small library that no one had used since his wife's death, and dozens of children in conditions similar to Lucia's who had never had the opportunity to learn to read. "I can write quite well," he said, taking the stick from the girl's hands. "Do you want me to teach you while I'm here?" Lucia's eyes lit up in a way Benjamin would never forget. "Really? Really? Let's start with your name." During the following afternoons, while Benjamin's leg finished healing, it became custom for him and Lucia to sit together in the patio, tracing letters in the earth with a stick, then on a piece of craft paper Benjamin obtained in the village, until the girl could write her full name, and afterward her mother's with a clumsy but proud, clear hand. Clara, observing those afternoons from the window while she sewed, felt something move deeply in her chest at seeing the patience with which that man, under no obligation to do so, dedicated entire hours to teaching a girl who was not his to read. No other man, not even Gregorio in the years they were married, had ever taken that kind of time with Lucia. And that silent, constant observation built in Clara a trust that no words could have built with the same strength. "Someday I'm going to be able to read whole books like the ones you say there are on the big haciendas," Lucia said one afternoon with the absolute determination of children who still know no limits. "Someday you're going to be able to read all the books you want, Lucia. I promise you." Benjamin imagined, as he made that promise, how soon and in what particular way he would be in a position to keep it. Lucia, who at first had looked at him with a natural distrust of children toward strangers, ended by adopting him as if he were part of the family. She showed him the stones she collected in the patio, told him stories she invented on the spot, and one afternoon, without any warning, took his hand while they walked toward the well and did not let go the entire way. "Why are you always sad, Senor Benjamin?" the girl asked him one afternoon, while he carved with an old knife a wooden figure that would become, when finished, a small horse for her. Benjamin remained silent a moment, surprised by the direct question. "I'm not always sad, Lucia." "Yes, you are. I see it in your eyes when you think no one is looking." The girl returned to her play, unaware of the weight of what she had just said, while Benjamin felt that this 7-year-old creature had seen in an instant what none of the women who had tried to court him in the hacienda had even attempted to see. It was Dona Herminia Salazar, the village healer and old friend of Clara's mother, who first noticed the change. "That look of yours is not the look of someone caring for a sick man," she told Clara one afternoon, while both selected medicinal herbs in the healer's back patio. "It's the look of someone who has already begun to love someone without realizing it." "Don't talk nonsense, Dona Herminia. That man has nothing, same as me. In a few days he'll leave to look for work somewhere else, and we'll never hear of him again." "Sometimes those who have nothing are the ones who have the most to give," the old woman answered without lifting her eyes from the leaves she was sorting. "And sometimes, daughter, the heart doesn't ask whether it's convenient or not." Clara did not answer, but that night, while serving supper, she caught herself observing Benjamin's hands with the same attention with which he observed hers, noticing how they had filled with small blisters from work he was not used to, and feeling, against all her will to remain guarded, that something softened in her chest every time he smiled. The first Sunday after Benjamin could walk without the cane, Clara asked him to accompany her to sell bread at the village market, because Lucia had stayed with a mild fever in Dona Herminia's care, and she needed extra hands to carry the baskets. The market of San Geronimo del Valle was a small, bustling world that set itself up every Sunday in the main square, composed of vegetables, fabrics, poultry, and sweets that the village women sold under patched awnings. Benjamin, accustomed to people removing their hats as he passed, discovered that morning what it meant to walk among the crowd without anyone noticing him, pushed by strangers' elbows, ignored by the merchants who barely gave him a glance before turning to Clara for the bargaining. "Carry it carefully. If that basket falls, we lose the whole week's profit," Clara warned him, handing him a basket full of still warm loaves. "Do you always come alone to sell?" "Before I used to come with Gregorio. After he died, I learned to carry twice as much without anyone's help." Benjamin said nothing, but felt a stab of something resembling shame at remembering that he, on the other hand, had never had to learn to carry anything alone because there had always been an Anselmo, a foreman, an employee ready to do it for him. During the morning, while Clara bargained with the skill of years of practice, Benjamin observed how she treated each customer with firmness when someone tried to pay less than was fair, and with silent generosity when an old woman did not have enough to complete the payment for a loaf of bread, and Clara, without a word, handed it over anyway, dismissing its importance with a wave of the hand. "What did you do with the lady a while ago?" Benjamin said when they were already gathering the empty baskets at the end of the morning. "You gave her the bread?" "I didn't give it to her. I put it on account. She always pays when she can." "And if she never can," Clara shrugged, as if the question made little sense to her, "then she will have eaten something this week, and that is the only thing that truly matters." That answer, said with such naturalness, stayed circling in Benjamin's head during the walk back to the hut, because he understood he was facing a form of generosity completely different from the one he knew. Not the calculated generosity of someone who donates a portion of his excess to feel good about himself, but the generosity of someone who gives from scarcity because she cannot conceive of any other way of living among her fellow human beings. It happened one afternoon at the end of April, when Benjamin's leg had already healed almost completely, but he kept finding pretexts to stay one more day and then another. Clara was sewing by the window, taking advantage of the last light of the afternoon, mending one of Lucia's shirts, when the silver thimble she wore on her finger slipped and fell to the floor, rolling until it stopped beside Benjamin's feet. He bent to pick it up. It was a small thimble, worn by use, with an almost erased initial engraved on the base, an M for Maria, the name of Clara's mother. "It was my mother's," Clara said, extending her hand to receive it. "It's the only thing I have left of her." Benjamin did not hand it over immediately. He held it an instant between his fingers, feeling the light weight of that object that represented, he understood without anyone explaining it to him, an entire life of work inherited from generation to generation, an entire dignity that could neither be bought nor sold. "It must weigh a lot to be so small," he said, and as he said it, instead of letting it fall into Clara's open hand, he gently closed her fingers around the thimble, holding her hand between his a moment longer than necessary. Neither of them said anything more. Clara felt the warmth of those rough hands, newly hardened by work, enclosing hers. And for a moment, the only sound in the hut was the crackling of the hearth and the distant song of a grackle perched in a tree in the patio. Outside, the sky was tinged with orange and purple, and neither of them looked away from the other until Lucia came running and asking if supper was ready yet. That night, when the girl fell asleep, Clara remained awake looking at the thimble in her hands, wondering what kind of man this was who had entered her life without a full name, without a past to tell, and who nevertheless, in so simple a gesture, had made her feel something she believed buried along with her husband 3 years earlier. Benjamin, for his part, sat that night in the patio under the stars, and for the first time since his wife's death, felt that the emptiness he carried inside was not the same as always. It had not disappeared, but something was beginning, very slowly, to fill it again. The days passed. Benjamin decided once more to postpone his return to the hacienda with the pretext that the leg still needed strength, although he knew, and Clara probably knew as well, that the true reason was another. He helped with the sewing, carrying fabrics to other houses in the village. He learned to make bread under Clara's patient instruction, and at night, when Lucia was already asleep, they sat together outside the hut talking of everything and nothing, always avoiding, by tacit agreement, speaking of either of their pasts. "Did you never have a family, Benjamin?" Clara asked him one night, looking at the stars. "I had a wife," he answered carefully. "She died years ago. Since then, I've been alone." "I'm sorry." "You don't have to be. One learns to live with absences, even if one never quite gets used to them." Clara nodded, understanding that phrase better than anyone, because she too carried the absence of her own husband, dead in an accident in the fields when Lucia was barely 2 years old. "Sometimes I think life takes from us what we most love, just to see if we are capable of remaining standing," she said. "And you remain standing," Benjamin answered, looking at her with an intensity that made Clara lower her eyes, blushing, with her back straighter than any person he had ever known. It was in those days of silent coexistence that both of them, without ever naming it, began to build something that neither of them knew how to stop or how to begin to call by its true name. Another night, with Lucia already deeply asleep, Clara and Benjamin remained seated outside the hut longer than usual, wrapped in the cool silence of the Sierra and the occasional call of an owl hidden among the trees. "What did you dream of as a young woman before life put all these burdens on you?" Benjamin asked, genuinely curious, because until that moment he had known Clara only in her role as mother and tireless worker, without having paused to ask who she had been before all that. Clara remained thoughtful a long moment, as if unearthing a memory she had not visited in years. "I wanted to be a teacher," she finally confessed with a nostalgic smile. "When I was a girl, the village teacher let me help her with the little ones, and I dreamed of studying in the capital so I could return someday and have my own school. But my parents died young. I had to take care of my younger brothers and sisters. Then I married Gregorio, and that dream stayed locked in some drawer I no longer even remember where I put it. You could still fulfill it." Clara laughed, a soft laugh without bitterness, but also without too much hope. At 30, a widow, with a daughter to support and barely a plot of land to defend, there isn't much room to dream of schools, Benjamin. One learns to save those dreams for one's daughters, not for oneself. "And what did you dream of?" she asked then, returning the question with a curiosity she had not felt in a long time for another person's life. Benjamin hesitated, aware that any honest answer brought him dangerously close to revealing who he really was. "I dreamed of having a large family, children running through the fields, and old age accompanied. Life gave me something else. It gave me work, responsibilities, and afterward it took away the only person with whom I thought I would build all that. I am sorry. Don't be. Sometimes I think life didn't take that dream from me forever. It only put it on pause, waiting for the right moment to give it to me in another form." Clara felt that those words carried a weight that went beyond the obvious, although she did not dare to ask exactly what he meant. And both remained silent a while longer, looking at the stars that were beginning to appear among the last clouds of the storm that had dissipated that afternoon. In mid-April, the entire village prepared for the annual feast of the patron saint of San Geronimo del Valle, a celebration that included a procession, band music, fireworks that exploded from dawn, and a dance in the plaza that gathered families from all the neighboring ranches. Clara, who in previous years had attended only a short while, carrying Lucia, asleep in her arms before returning early to the hut because she had no one to leave her with, this time let herself be persuaded by Donna Herminia to stay until the last piece of music played. "Go, daughter. Enjoy yourself a little. Life isn't only work and worry," the healer told her, gently pushing her toward the plaza illuminated with paper lanterns. Benjamin, who had been helping load tables and benches for the celebration along with other men of the village, found himself that night watching Clara from a distance, dressed in her only good dress, of a blue faded by the years but carefully ironed, laughing with other women of the village with a freedom he had not seen in her before. Lucia, already feeling better from the fever, ran among the village children chasing a wooden top, and for an instant, seeing the girl laugh without any care, Benjamin felt that this small, poor village held something that the wealth of Los Laureles had never managed to give him, a simple sense of belonging, without pretensions, without calculations. When the band began to play a slow waltz, several couples ventured to dance in the center of the plaza. Benjamin, overcoming the shyness he had not felt since youth, approached Clara. "Will you grant me this dance?" he asked, extending his hand with a gesture that, without his noticing, still retained something of the elegance of a landowner, even though dressed in a peon's clothes. Clara hesitated an instant, aware of the curious glances of some neighbors, but finally accepted, and both moved clumsily at first, then with more ease, among the other couples turning under the warm light of the lanterns. "It's been a long time since I danced," Clara confessed with her cheeks flushed, though she did not know whether from the effort or the closeness. "Me neither," Benjamin answered, and it was true, although for reasons she could not imagine. He had forgotten that it felt good. They danced 2 more pieces, and when the music stopped to give way to the fireworks that announced the end of the procession, both remained standing face to face, breathing hard, not knowing quite what to say after a moment neither of them had planned or expected. "I think we should look for Lucia," Clara finally said, breaking the instant with a nervous smile. Yes, of course. But neither of them moved immediately, and for a second, under the distant roar of the fireworks, their hands remained intertwined a little longer than necessary before both, almost at the same time, decided to let go and return to the prudence that had accompanied them since the first day. Toward the end of April, when Benjamin's leg was almost completely recovered, a neighboring rancher who had not yet been pressured by Fausto Renteria temporarily hired several day laborers from the village, among them Clara, and for the first time also Benjamin, to help with the harvest of a wheat field before the heavy May rains arrived. The work was brutal for someone who had never spent an entire day under the sun cutting wheat with a sickle. His back hurt after the first hour. His hands, already hardened by weeks of lesser work, filled with new blisters, and sweat ran down his forehead without respite under the palm hat Clara had lent him. "Don't stop so long between cuts, Benjamin, or we won't finish the job before nightfall," Clara told him without stopping her own work, with a constant rhythm that Benjamin admired more and more. "Not all of us were born with your endurance, Clara," he answered between gasps, provoking a genuine laugh from her. At the end of the day, exhausted as he had never been in his entire life as a landowner, Benjamin sat with the other day laborers to eat the tortillas with beans the ranch women distributed as partial payment for the day's work, and he felt in that shared weariness a simple fraternity he had never experienced sitting at his own table at the hacienda, surrounded by silver cutlery and food served by others. "You know, Clara, I think I had never truly understood what work means until this day," he confessed that night, already back at the hut, with his whole body aching but with a strange sensation of fullness. "Work is not a punishment, Benjamin, even if sometimes it tires the body to the bones. It's what keeps our heads high when everything else seems to want to bend us." That night Benjamin slept as he had not slept in years, without the nightmares of emptiness that used to visit him in his solitary bed at the hacienda, lulled instead by the honest exhaustion of a day of true work beside the woman who, without either of them yet fully knowing it, had become the silent center of his entire life. One Saturday afternoon, Clara decided to prepare molda olla, a dish she made only on special occasions because the ingredients, though humble, required a little more expense than she could allow herself every week. That time, with the market bread sales a little better than usual, she decided to treat herself and asked Benjamin to help her grind the chiles on the stone matate that had belonged to her grandmother. "I've never used one of these," Benjamin confessed, awkwardly holding the mano of the matate. "It shows," Clara laughed, a clear, genuine sound that Benjamin was already beginning to treasure. "Look, like this, with the weight of the body, not only of the arm." She placed herself behind him, guiding his hands over the stone, with a closeness neither of them commented on aloud, although both felt the heat of that proximity like a silent current. Benjamin, clumsy at first, gradually found the rhythm under Clara's guidance, crushing the dried chiles until they became a thick, aromatic paste that filled the hut with a sharp, deep smell. "My grandmother used to say that food tastes different when it's made with the hands of someone one wants nearby," Clara commented without thinking too much about the weight of those words until she had already said them, and then she blushed slightly, concentrating again on the matate to hide it. Benjamin, who perfectly perceived the blush, decided not to point it out, although he stored that phrase in his memory like a small treasure. They cooked together all afternoon with Lucia, helping chop onion amid laughter at the burning in her eyes. And when they finally sat down to eat, already with the sun setting over the Sierra, Benjamin tasted the mole with an attention that surprised Clara. "What did you think of it?" she asked expectantly. "It's the best thing I've eaten in years," he answered with complete sincerity, because indeed, among all the banquets he had tasted at the hacienda throughout his life, none had the particular flavor of something cooked with the rough hands of a woman who put into each plate the same care with which she sustained her entire life. That night, while they washed the dishes together under the light of a candle. Benjamin understood that he no longer only admired Clara for her strength and her dignity. He had begun, without being able to help it, to build with her a small, simple daily life that in his innermost self he valued more than any luxury he had known at Los Laureles. As usually happens in small villages, the prolonged presence of a stranger in the house of a widow did not take long to become a topic of conversation among the women who gathered every afternoon at the communal wash basin. "That man has already been living more than a month with Clara Villaseñor," commented a neighbor named Petra, scrubbing a shirt against the wash basin stone. "And nobody knows where he came from or where he's going." "They say he's a good worker," answered another woman in a tone that made clear that goodwill did not entirely eliminate the suspicion. "But they also say they're already very close for him to be merely a grateful peon and the woman who saved him." The gossip eventually reached Clara's ears through Dona Herminia, who told her without beating around the bush one afternoon while they selected herbs together. "I don't care what they say, Dona Herminia. That man has done nothing improper, and neither have I. I know, daughter, and I'm not telling you so you'll worry, but so you'll be prepared. In these villages, tongues move faster than the truth, and sometimes they end up hurting the one who least deserves it." Clara, however, decided not to let herself be intimidated by the rumors. She continued her routine without hiding Benjamin's presence or justifying it to anyone, convinced that her conscience was clear and that other people's opinions, however harsh, were not worth the price of denying the help she had given a wounded man. Benjamin, upon learning of the comments from Clara herself, felt a new stab of guilt, aware that his presence, without either of them having sought it, was putting at risk the reputation of a woman who already carried enough difficulties without adding the weight of village gossip. "If my presence is causing you problems, I can leave," he told her that night with sincerity, although the mere idea of leaving tightened his chest in a way he had not expected. "You're not going anywhere, Benjamin," Clara answered firmly, surprising herself with the speed and certainty of her response. "Bad tongues are not going to decide who enters and who leaves my house." 2 weeks after the feast, Anselmo Bravo, worried by his employer's prolonged absence, ventured to approach the village disguised as a cloth merchant, with the pretext of selling merchandise house to house, to verify with his own eyes that Benjamin was still alive and without serious setbacks. He found him cutting firewood behind Clara's hut, with his shirt sleeves rolled up and his face tanned by the sun of several weeks. So different from the pale, withdrawn man who had left the hacienda that Anselmo took an instant to recognize him completely. "Patron," he murmured, approaching cautiously when he verified that no one else was nearby. "You had me worried. I almost sent the rurales looking for you. Anselmo, what are you doing here? If someone recognizes you, everything can get complicated." "I came in disguise." "Don't worry, but I needed to see with my own eyes that everything was all right. Almost 3 weeks have passed." Benjamin lowered the axe and wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, a gesture that already came naturally without the clumsiness of the first days. "Everything is fine, Anselmo. Better than fine. It shows on your face, Patron, if you'll allow me to say so. It's been years since I've seen you like this. There's a woman, Anselmo. Her name is Clara, and there's a little girl, Lucia, who has stolen my heart without my being able to do anything to prevent it." Anselmo smiled, a sincere smile that contrasted with the worry he had carried for weeks. "I'm glad, Patron, totally glad. But I'm also going to tell you something you may not want to hear. The longer you wait without telling that woman the truth, the harder it will be when she finally finds out. And she will find out, Patron. Sooner or later, the truth always comes out in these villages. I know. I'm looking for the right moment. I only ask that you not wait too long. Trust is like freshly baked bread. It tastes better the fresher it is." Benjamin remained thoughtful after Anselmo left, with the steward's warning resonating in his head for the rest of the afternoon. Meanwhile, Clara, completely unaware of that visit, continued preparing supper without suspecting that the man who warmed her heart carried a secret growing ever heavier to hold. One afternoon of light rain, when Benjamin accompanied Clara to take some herbs to Dona Herminia, the old woman, perhaps softened by the comforting sound of water falling on the sheet metal roof, shared with them a fragment of her own story that she rarely told anyone. "I also had a man like that many years ago," she said, serving café de olla in 3 clay cups. "A muleteer who passed through this village carrying merchandise to the capital. We loved each other for 2 whole years, until one day he left promising to return and never came back. I never knew whether he died on the road or simply found another life somewhere else. I stayed waiting so long that when I finally understood he was not going to return, the years for having children of my own had already gone. I'm very sorry, Dona Herminia," Clara said, taking the old woman's wrinkled hand. "Don't be, daughter. From that sorrow, I learned to heal others, because I understood that the pain that is not healed in time becomes a slow poison. That's why I tell both of you, even though you haven't asked me anything, don't let the fear of losing prevent you from having what life is offering you right now." Benjamin felt that those words, spoken without knowing his true situation, pointed directly at the weight he had been carrying for days. And that night, while they walked back under the drizzle, he was on the point of telling Clara everything. The words formed in his throat, ready to come out. But upon seeing the tranquility with which she walked beside him, simply enjoying the cool rain on her face, he decided to wait one more day, without knowing that that one more day would become, without his planning it, the difference between telling the truth of his own will or having the truth catch up with him first by the force of circumstances. It was only a few days later that Lucia woke up burning with fever, with glassy eyes and a dry cough that deeply worried Clara. Dona Herminia came at once with her herbal remedies, but warned that if the fever did not go down by dawn, it would be necessary to fetch the doctor from the neighboring village, a journey of almost 2 hours on horseback. Benjamin, without anyone asking him, stayed awake the entire night beside Clara, taking turns placing damp cloths on the girl's forehead, heating water, holding Clara when exhaustion and fear threatened to break her. "I'm not going to lose her too," Clara murmured at one moment in the early hours with a broken voice, referring, without saying it openly, to the fear she had carried since Gregorio's death, the fear that life would again snatch from her someone she loved. "You're not going to lose her," Benjamin said, taking her hand firmly. "This girl has the same spirit as her mother. She's going to get through this." Near dawn, the fever finally broke, and Lucia slept peacefully for the first time in hours. Clara, exhausted, fell asleep sitting beside her daughter's bed, and Benjamin, without thinking too much, covered her with a blanket and remained watching over the sleep of both until the sun rose, understanding in that silent vigil that there was no longer any turning back in what he felt for that small family that life, in the most unexpected way, had placed in his path. Meanwhile, on the neighboring hacienda, Don Fausto Renneria received with growing displeasure the reports that Don Benjamin Valderrama, the most prosperous landowner in the region, had disappeared without a trace for almost 3 weeks. "This is the opportunity we've been waiting for," he told his administrator, a thin man of shifty gaze named Praxedes. "Without Benjamin at the head of Los Laureles and with that stubborn widow refusing to sell her land, it's time to move the pieces." Don Fausto had for years coveted the small lands that surrounded the hacienda Los Laureles, plots that, united, would have given him control over access to the river and over a good part of the commercial routes of the region. Among those plots was precisely the small holding inherited by Clara Villasenor from her parents, a piece of land that was worth very little in money, but that represented strategically a key piece for his plans. "Cut off the access to the stream that woman uses for washing and watering," Fausto ordered. "Talk to the village merchants so no one buys her bread. And talk to the ranchers who hire her for the harvest so no one gives her work. And if she doesn't yield, Patron, then we'll bring out the documents." Fausto had spent months forging, with the help of a corrupt notary from the state capital, a title of ownership that claimed the land of Clara actually belonged within the limits of his own hacienda. A carefully constructed fraud that only awaited the opportune moment to present itself before the authorities. Fausto had not always been known in the region as a man of shady methods. He had inherited his hacienda already diminished by the land divisions after the years of revolution, and since then he had cultivated a silent obsession with recovering, plot by plot, the extent he considered belonged to him by right of blood and surname. He saw in every small holding of the surroundings not another life, but a missing piece in the map he had carried drawn in his head since youth. And that obsession over the years had gradually corroded any scruple he might once have had. His first approach to Clara months earlier had been courteous in appearance. He had presented himself one Sunday after Mass, offering her a sum that to any other woman in the village would have seemed generous, arguing in a calm voice that a widow alone had no reason to carry the responsibilities of maintaining a plot of land that would be much simpler for her to move into the village near other families, with enough money to live quietly for a couple of years. "I thank you, Don Fausto, but this land is the only thing my parents left me, and here I intend to stay," Clara had answered then, without yet suspecting that that polite refusal would unleash over the following months an increasingly aggressive persecution. Fausto, accustomed to no one telling him no twice, had interpreted that refusal as a personal challenge, and from then on, with the calculated patience of one who has learned to wait for the right moment, had begun to move his contacts and influence to gradually close off Clara's possibilities of sustaining herself without her land. Clara began to notice the effects in the last week of April. The village baker, who always bought part of her production, told her with evident discomfort that he could no longer continue doing so. Two families that used to hire her for sewing almost shamefacedly informed her they had decided to look for another seamstress. And one morning, when she went to fetch water from a stream that ran near her land, she found the passage blocked by a new barbed wire fence that had not been there the week before. "Someone is doing this on purpose," she told Dona Herminia with a voice charged with an anguish she tried to hide. "I don't know who or why, but I feel they're closing every door on me at the same time." "You already know who it is, daughter. Everyone in the village knows that Don Fausto has wanted these lands for years." Clara clenched her fists, feeling a mixture of fear and rage she had not felt since her husband's death. "I have no way to fight a man like him." That night, when Benjamin noticed the tension on Clara's face, he asked her what was happening. She hesitated a long moment before answering, and when she did not mention Fausto by name nor recount the complete details. "I have problems with the land," she said simply. "But don't worry, it's not something you can help with." Benjamin felt a stab of frustration at hearing those words, understanding that Clara, believing him as poor as herself, would never think of asking him for help to confront a man with the power of Don Fausto Renteria. And for the first time since he had arrived at that hut, he felt the weight of his disguise as an unbearable burden. That same night, after Lucia fell asleep, Benjamin sat beside Clara in the patio, determined to tell her at least part of the truth. "Clara, there's something I must tell you." She looked at him expectantly with those dark eyes that had learned to read every gesture of his over the past weeks. "I'm not exactly who you think I am," he began, feeling the words stick in his throat for the first time in his life. I have more resources than I appear to. I could perhaps help you with the land problem." Clara looked at him with an expression that mixed surprise and a sudden hardness Benjamin had not seen in her before. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if you let me intervene, perhaps I can speak with whoever is causing these problems, or find a way to—" "No," the word came out firm, cutting. "I don't need anyone to speak for me, Benjamin. Not you, not any man. If you have some savings you haven't told me about, I thank you, but this is something I must resolve myself. It has already cost me enough pride to let you stay in my house without charging you anything. I'm not going to become the woman who depends on a peon to save her land." Benjamin understood with painful clarity that he had underestimated the depth of Clara's pride, and that a half offer, without the complete truth behind it, sounded precisely like what she most feared: pity disguised as generosity. That night, while Clara slept, Benjamin went out to the patio and was on the point of saddling the horse and leaving forever, convinced that his mere presence, with the secret he carried, could only bring more complications to a woman who already had enough. He thought that perhaps the most honest thing would be to disappear without explanations, to let Clara resolve her life without the added burden of a stranger who could not even offer her the complete truth. He had his hand on the animal's bridle when he heard a little voice behind him. "Are you going to leave, Senor Benjamin?" It was Lucia, who had awakened and was watching him from the door of the hut, wrapped in her rebozo, with an expression of alarm that tightened his heart. "No, my daughter," he answered, releasing the bridle at once. "I only came to check that the horse was well tied. Go back to sleep. Do you promise me? Because my mama doesn't say it, but I know she already loves you a lot, and I love you a lot too. If you leave, both of us are going to be very sad." Those words, spoken with the brutal honesty only children possess, finished convincing Benjamin that flight was not an option and that the only dignified way out was to stay, resolve Fausto's problem from his true position, and afterward face the consequences of the truth, however painful they might be. "I promise you, Lucia, I'm not going anywhere without saying goodbye properly." The girl, satisfied with that answer, returned to bed, and Benjamin remained a long while more in the patio under the stars, finally making the decision that would mark the course of the following days. He swallowed what remained to be said, and that night, lying on the cot Clara insisted on yielding to him, he made a decision. He would have to resolve the problem of Fausto Renteria, but from his true position, with irrefutable proof. And only afterward, when the threat was neutralized, would he reveal who he really was. 2 days later, while Benjamin had gone out early with the pretext of looking for work at a nearby ranch, actually riding back toward Los Laureles to meet secretly with Anselmo, Don Fausto Renteria presented himself personally at Clara's hut, accompanied by 2 armed men who waited mounted at a certain distance. "Good morning, Senora Villaseñor," Fausto said, removing his hat with a courtesy that did not reach his eyes. "I come to offer you one last time a dignified way out of your situation." Clara, with Lucia hidden behind her, kept her back straight and her gaze firm. "I have nothing to discuss with you, Don Fausto. This land is mine, inherited from my parents, and it is not for sale. I'm afraid the law will soon say otherwise." Fausto took from his jacket a folded document, showing it without handing it over. "I have here a title that demonstrates these lands always belonged within the limits of my hacienda. A registration error years ago assigned them incorrectly to your family. I can arrange this in 2 ways. You accept a modest compensation and move with dignity. Or I present these documents before the district judge and you lose everything without receiving a single peso. Those documents are false, and you know it." Fausto smiled, a cold smile that left no doubt about what he was capable of doing. "You have 1 week to decide, Senora. I suggest you not waste it with pride you cannot afford." Before withdrawing, Fausto made an additional stop at the house of an old neighboring peasant named Don Refugio, whose small plot also figured among those he coveted, and warned him with the same cold smile that any help he gave that woman would have direct consequences for his own family. The old Refugio, terrified, stopped speaking to Clara for several weeks, and that silence imposed by fear became for her one more proof of how far Don Fausto was willing to go to get what he wanted. He rode away with the same unhurried pace with which he had arrived, leaving Clara trembling with rage and impotence, but more determined than ever not to yield a single centimeter of what her parents had left her. That night, after Lucia fell asleep, Clara sat alone in the patio with her mother's silver thimble between her fingers, turning it slowly while she mentally reviewed all the possibilities she had for confronting a man with the power and resources of Don Fausto Renteria. She found no clear way out. She could speak with the district judge, but she knew that the word of a widow without resources weighed little against the documents, false or not, of an influential landowner. She could seek help among the neighbors, but most already lived under the fear of Fausto's reprisals, a fear that had proven justified with the closing of her own sources of work. She clenched the thimble in her fist, feeling the cold metal against her palm, and for the first time in a long while allowed herself to cry in silence, not from defeat, but from pure accumulated exhaustion during 3 years of sustaining alone every battle of her life. She thought fleetingly of telling Benjamin everything, of asking him for real help, but pride, that same pride that had kept her standing since Gregorio's death, prevented her from even imagining the possibility of becoming a burden to a man who, as far as she knew, also had nothing to offer her except his company. "We're going to get out of this, Mama Villaseñor, the way we always get out," she murmured to herself, repeating a phrase her own mother used to say in the most difficult moments. And with that inherited determination, she wiped away her tears and went back in the house, resolved not to let Lucia see her defeated the next day. The scene that Clara told no one out of shame, and so as not to worry Benjamin with something she considered her personal cross, nevertheless reached Benjamin's ears 2 days later, when Dona Herminia, worried by Clara's pallor, told him without knowing she was speaking to the only man in the region with enough power to stop Fausto Renteria. "That Fausto has been tightening the screws on poor Clara for weeks," the old woman told him while handing him a chamomile tea for the nerves. "False documents, threats, armed men standing in front of her house. And she, stubborn like her mother, doesn't want to ask anyone for help." Benjamin felt the blood boil in a way he had not felt in years. Not from wounded pride at knowing Clara did not trust him enough to ask for help, but from pure fury at knowing someone was threatening the woman and the little girl who, without intending to, had again given him a reason to get up every morning. That same night, while Clara slept exhausted by the tension of recent days, Benjamin left the hut without making noise, mounted the horse Anselmo had left hidden near the village, and rode back to the hacienda, Los Laureles, under the light of the full moon. Before departing, however, there was a brief but decisive moment. Dona Herminia, who had gone out to gather night herbs near the hut, ran into Benjamin just as he was preparing to leave, and something in the old woman's gaze told him she knew, or at least suspected, far more than she said. "Go where you have to go, young man," she told him without further preamble. "But when you return, do it with the complete truth in your hands. That woman has lost too much in life to also lose trust in someone who is beginning to give her back the desire to love. Don't break that for her, even if your intentions are good." Benjamin remained looking at her an instant, surprised that the old woman had intuited so much without his saying a word. "I don't intend to break anything, Dona Herminia. I intend to fix everything." "I hope so, son, because Clara's heart no longer has much more to give if it fails her again." Those words remained resonating in Benjamin's mind throughout the entire ride back to the hacienda, as both a warning and a promise at the same time. When Benjamin arrived at the hacienda, Los Laureles, past midnight, he found Anselmo waiting for him in the main study, just as they had agreed weeks earlier in case of an emergency. "I need you to gather everything we have on the properties bordering Don Fausto Renteria's hacienda," Benjamin said, for the first time in weeks removing the worn Peon's clothes. "And I need to speak with Notary Villa Gomez this same night, even if we have to drag him out of bed." "What's happening, Patron?" "Fausto is trying to steal the land from a village widow with forged documents. And that widow, Anselmo, is the woman who saved my life 3 weeks ago." Anselmo, who knew his employer well enough to recognize the determination in his voice, asked no more questions and set to work at once. During the following 3 days, Benjamin deployed all the machinery his position allowed him. He hired a lawyer from the state capital, a meticulous man named Licenciado Obregon Salcedo, who traced the origin of the forged document to a corrupt notary who had received a considerable payment from Don Fausto Renteria 3 months earlier. He gathered witnesses, including 2 employees of the notary's office willing to declare under oath about the irregularities in the registration. And he also obtained a certified copy of the original property register that demonstrated beyond any doubt that the land had legitimately belonged to the Villaseñor family for more than 40 years. The silent promise of Anselmo, upon arriving at Los Laureles that same early morning, even before meeting with Licenciado Obregon, Benjamin stopped a moment in the main study, where Anselmo already awaited him with an oil lamp lit and the tense face of one who has spent weeks carrying a worry he could share with no one else. "Patron, before you begin with all this, I need to tell you something," Anselmo said, carefully closing the study door. "While you were away, rumors ran through the hacienda that perhaps you were not going to return. Some peons began to grow restless, and 2 families who rent land on the borders came to ask me whether they should look for another employer before the property changed hands." Benjamin felt the weight of that revelation, understanding that his prolonged absence had not only put his own personal search at risk, but also the stability of dozens of families who depended on the hacienda for their livelihood. What did you tell them? I told them the half-truth, that you were resolving a very important personal matter and that you would return soon. I trusted that would be so, Patron, because I've known you since you were young, and I know you would never abandon what your father and your grandfather built. I'm not going to let them down, Anselmo, nor them, nor Clara, nor anyone else who depends on me. I only need to resolve this in the right way. I know, Patron. That's why I'm here working at this hour of the early morning instead of sleeping, because I trust that whatever the result, you are going to do what is right for everyone involved. That conversation, brief but charged with silent weight, reaffirmed in Benjamin the urgency of resolving Fausto Renteria's problem as quickly as possible. Not only for the well-being of Clara and Lucia, but also for the responsibility he carried on his shoulders toward an entire community that depended to a greater or lesser degree on the decisions he would make in the following days. The investigation was not simple. The corrupt notary, a man named Casimiro Yacida, at first refused to collaborate, fearful of Don Fausto's reprisals, until Licenciado Obregon Salcedo made him see that the alternative was to bear alone the entire penal responsibility for the forgery, while the true intellectual author remained free. You can continue protecting a man who will never lift a finger for you when this is discovered, or you can collaborate with justice and at least save your own skin, the lawyer told him, seated opposite him in a discreet office in the state capitol. After an entire night of doubts, he finally signed a sworn declaration detailing how Don Fausto Renteria had paid him a considerable sum months earlier to alter the district property registers and create a false title that assigned Clara Villasenor's land within the limits of Fausto's hacienda. With that declaration in hand, Benjamin and Licenciado Obregon traveled to the General Archive of the state capitol, where after hours of searching among dusty files they found the original property register dated more than 40 years earlier, which confirmed beyond any doubt that the land had been legitimately assigned to Clara's grandfather and afterward transmitted by direct inheritance to her father and finally to her. With this and the notary's declaration, Patron, we have more than enough, the lawyer said, closing the portfolio with satisfaction. Fausto Renteria has no possibility of sustaining his claim before a judge. Benjamin felt for the first time in days that he could breathe with some relief, although the weight of knowing that Clara was still alone facing Fausto's pressure, without knowing that help was on the way, did not allow him to rest completely. With all the proof in hand, Benjamin presented himself before the district judge of the region, a respected man named Judge Anschers, and laid out the complete case, including the evidence of the documentary fraud orchestrated by Fausto Renteria. This is enough for an immediate summons order, Don Benjamin, the judge said, reviewing the documents with a furrowed brow, and enough also to initiate a criminal process for forgery if you decide to take it that far. I want Senora Villasenor protected immediately. The rest we will decide afterward. Meanwhile, in San Geronimo del Valle, Clara lived the most anguishing days since her husband's death. Fausto had fulfilled his threat of completely cutting off any possibility of work for her in the village, and her reserves of maize and beans were beginning to run dangerously low. To make matters worse, Benjamin, the man in whom she had begun to trust more than she had allowed herself to trust anyone in years, had disappeared without explanation 3 days earlier, leaving only a hasty note that said, "Trust me, I'll be back soon." He left the same way he arrived. Clara told Dona Herminia with a bitterness she tried to hide without entirely succeeding, without giving explanations. Sometimes men disappear to arrange the things they cannot arrange while present. Daughter, give him time. But time for Clara was running out. On the 6th day of the deadline given by Fausto, a cart stopped in front of her hut loaded with armed men, and Don Fausto Renteria himself descended with an expression of triumph he did not bother to hide. "The deadline is over, Senora Villasenor. I bring with me the eviction order signed by the district judge, as well as these men to make sure the departure is orderly." Clara, with Lucia clinging to her skirt, felt the ground open under her feet but kept her back straight as always, refusing to let Fausto see her collapse. "This land is mine," she repeated with a voice that trembled only slightly. "And it will continue being mine as long as I have breath to defend it." "Your breath is worth nothing against the law, Senora." Scene 3. The public confrontation. It was at that exact instant, when Fausto's men began to dismount to begin the eviction, that an elegant carriage drawn by 2 black horses Clara had never seen in the village stopped with a clatter in front of the hut. From it descended a man dressed in an impeccable landowner's suit, polished boots, a wide-brimmed hat embroidered in silver, and a presence that made even Fausto's armed men instinctively take a step back. Clara took an instant to recognize, under that fine clothing and that freshly trimmed beard, the same eyes she had cared for during weeks in her own bed, the same eyes that had held her hands beside the hearth the night the silver thimble fell. "Benjamin," she murmured, unable to believe what she saw. Behind him descended several more people. Anselmo Bravo the steward, Licenciado Obregon Salcedo with a portfolio of documents under his arm, an official court clerk, and 2 local authorities whom Clara recognized as direct representatives of the state government. "Fausto Renneria," Benjamin said with a voice Clara had never heard from him, a voice of absolute authority, the voice of Don Benjamin Valderrama, owner of the hacienda Los Laureles. "I have in my hands irrefutable proof that you forged the property documents of this land, bribing a notary from the capital to steal the land from an honest widow of this village." Fausto visibly paled, looking from one face to another, searching for something to say and finding nothing. This is a mistake." "There is no possible mistake, Don Fausto," Licenciado Obregon intervened, extending the documents toward the official clerk. "We have the sworn declaration of the official you bribed, the original property register, and a judicial order that immediately annuls any document presented by you." One of Fausto's armed men, upon seeing the presence of the state authorities, immediately lowered his weapon and began to retreat toward his horse, understanding that he was on the wrong side of the law. Moreover, Benjamin continued, taking a step toward Fausto with a firm gaze and short, direct words, without a trace of speech. Only the naked truth. "I want it to be clear before everyone present here that this woman and her daughter deserve respect, not threats, and that if you approach this land or any person under my protection again, you will answer before justice with all the weight my name can exert in this region." Don Fausto, defeated and humiliated before his own men and before the eyes of the entire village that had begun to gather, drawn by the uproar, mounted his horse without a word and withdrew, knowing he had lost not only the lands he coveted, but also a good part of the respect that remained to him in the region. Among the small crowd that had gathered, some of the neighbors who weeks earlier had murmured about the prolonged presence of a stranger in Clara's house now looked at one another with a mixture of astonishment and shame, understanding all at once that the man they had judged so lightly was in reality the most powerful landowner in the region, and that Clara, far from having acted imprudently, had demonstrated a generosity none of them had been capable of equaling. "Blessed be this woman who helps even strangers," murmured Petra, the same neighbor who had led the wash basin rumors, crossing herself with an expression of genuine repentance. Clara remained standing, motionless, looking at Benjamin with a mixture of relief and confusion that prevented her from articulating a word. After the clerk formally confirmed that the land continued to be legitimately hers, after the authorities withdrew, after Anselmo and the lawyer discreetly stepped aside to give privacy to the moment, Clara and Benjamin were finally left alone, face to face, with Lucia watching from the door of the hut, not entirely understanding what had just happened, except that Senor Benjamin, her friend of recent days, suddenly seemed a completely different man. A shared silence of several long seconds settled between them, while the dust raised by the horses slowly settled, and the afternoon sun bathed the land with a golden light that contrasted with the tension still floating in the air. Neither of them said anything during that instant. They only looked at each other, holding the full weight of everything that had happened, of everything that remained to be said. Clara finally began. "Don Benjamin Valderrama, he completed in a low voice, almost ashamed. Owner of the hacienda, Los Laureles. Clara took a step back, as if the words had struck her physically. Everything she had constructed in her mind about that man, the wounded Peon, the humble man who had learned to make bread with clumsiness, the silent friend of the nights under the stars, reordered itself all at once before the truth that stood in front of her. All this time, she said, her voice breaking, all those weeks you knew who you were, and you let me care for you as if you were any peon with nothing, when in reality you had more riches than half this village put together. Clara, let me explain. I never cared that you were poor, Benjamin. The tears Clara had forbidden herself to shed during weeks of threats and exhausting work finally found an outlet. I never cared about sharing the little I had. What truly hurts me, is that you never trusted me enough to tell me the truth. You let me believe a lie while I opened my house to you. My food, my... She stopped, unable to finish the phrase, unable to say aloud what she had begun to feel for him. Benjamin did not attempt to justify himself. He did not say that his intention had been good. He did not argue that he needed to prove whether someone's love could be genuine without the weight of his fortune in between. He understood, looking at the genuine pain on Clara's face, that any explanation at that moment would sound like an excuse, and that the only honest thing he could do was accept her pain without asking forgiveness immediately. You are right to be hurt, he said simply, and I'm not going to ask you to forgive me right now, because that would be asking for something I still don't deserve. I only ask for time to show you, not with words, that the man you knew in this hut, the one who carried firewood and learned to knead bread with clumsiness, that man never stopped existing. He was only hidden under a fortune that for 8 years prevented me from trusting anyone. Clara did not answer. She took Lucia by the hand, entered the hut, and closed the door slowly, leaving Benjamin standing in the patio with the bitter certainty that he had won the battle against Fausto Renneria, but had put at risk something far more valuable than any land or any fortune. The months that followed were for Benjamin the most difficult since his wife's death, but also the most determined of his entire life. He did not attempt to reconquer Clara with gifts or empty promises. He did not present himself at her hut with baskets of food or offers of money that she, with her pride intact, would have rejected at once. Instead, he began to transform the hacienda Los Laureles in a way he had never imagined before knowing her. He built a small rural school for the children of the peons and workers of the hacienda, hiring a teacher from the state capital so she could teach reading and writing to children who had never had that opportunity. He raised a community sewing workshop equipped with sewing machines brought from Guanajuato capital, designed specifically to give dignified work to the widows and single mothers of the region who, like Clara, struggled alone to raise their families. He founded a community bakery that supplied bread at a fair price to the neediest families of the village and established a support fund destined to aid those who were going through serious economic difficulties, without conditions, without interest, without the humiliation of charity in disguise. And when everything was ready, he sent a formal invitation delivered by Anselmo in person, addressed not to Clara as a woman, but to Clara Villasenor as a capable administrator, asking her to take charge of coordinating the sewing workshop and the distribution of the support fund, a position that would pay a fair salary and that would give her for the first time in her life real economic stability. Clara hesitated several days before accepting. She consulted with Dona Herminia, who listened to her with patience while she exposed her doubts. I don't want to accept because of him, Dona Herminia. I don't want him to think he can buy my forgiveness with schools and workshops. And who said you have to accept because of him? The old woman answered with wisdom. Except for those widows who are going to have dignified work. Except for those children who are going to learn to read. Except because you, better than anyone in this village, know what it means not to have opportunities, and now you have the possibility of giving them to others. What you feel for Benjamin is a separate matter and has its own time to resolve itself. Clara accepted the position and during the following months dedicated herself with all her energy to building, together with other women of the village, something that had never before existed in the region, a real support network for the most vulnerable families. She saw Benjamin on numerous occasions during those months, always in a professional context, always with the respectful distance he himself had imposed. He never pressured her, never reminded her of what had happened between them in the hut. He limited himself to working side by side with her when necessary, showing in every decision, in every gesture toward the workers of the hacienda. In every afternoon, he spent personally teaching the smallest children of the school to read, that the simple man Clara had known under the rain. The one who carried firewood with clumsiness and carved wooden figures for Lucia had not been a mask or an act. He had simply been who he really was, hidden for years under the weight of a fortune that had robbed him of the possibility of showing himself as he was. Lucia was among the first pupils enrolled in the new rural school, and although at first she felt strange sitting in a formal classroom after having learned her first letters in the earth of her house's patio, she soon became one of the most diligent pupils, already capable of reading complete books that the teacher lent her from the small library of the hacienda. Don Benjamin kept his promise. The girl told her mother one afternoon, proudly showing her a book of stories she had finished reading alone. He said that someday I would be able to read all the books I wanted. And look, I've almost finished this one. Clara, hearing those words, felt that the distance she had imposed with Benjamin was becoming harder and harder to maintain, because every gesture of his, however small, continued pointing in the same direction, that of a man who, beyond the fortune she now knew he possessed, remained fundamentally the same one who had carved a wooden horse for her daughter without expecting anything in return. One afternoon, almost 6 months after the confrontation with Fausto Renteria, Clara found Benjamin sitting alone in the patio of the newly built school, patiently carving a small wooden horse very similar to the one he had given Lucia so many months earlier. "Another horse?" she asked, stopping beside him. "This one is for the son of one of the seamstresses in the workshop," Benjamin answered without lifting his eyes, concentrated on the carving. "His birthday is next week, and his mother has no way to buy him a toy." Clara sat beside him in silence, observing his hands work the wood with the same dedication he had shown weeks earlier when he carved the horse for Lucia, without yet knowing he was the owner of everything that surrounded them. "I miss him," Clara finally said, surprising herself with the confession. "I miss the man of the hut. I know it's you, the same one. I understand it with my head, but my heart still needs time to stop feeling that it lost someone." Benjamin set the carving aside and looked at her directly with those eyes Clara had learned to read during weeks of forced coexistence because of a storm. "That man never left, Clara. He's sitting here beside you carving a wooden horse because he doesn't know what else to do with his hands when he's nervous about being near you." She could not help a small smile, the first genuine smile she had given Benjamin since the day of the confrontation. "I still haven't completely forgiven you. I know, and I'll wait as long as necessary." Almost 12 complete months passed from that storm that had changed the course of 2 lives, before Clara finally felt that the wound of distrust had healed enough to open space for something new. It was an ordinary morning while she reviewed with Benjamin the accounts of the sewing workshop when she, without prior notice, took his hand over the papers and simply said, "I think it's already time to stop waiting, Benjamin." The wedding was celebrated in the small chapel of San Geronimo del Valle, without luxuries or ostentation, just as Clara had requested, and just as Benjamin, who had learned during that year that true wealth is not measured in gold, had gladly accepted. The workers of the hacienda attended, the neighbors of the village, the women of the sewing workshop with their children dressed in their best clothes, and Dona Herminia Salazar, seated in the front row with tears of happiness she did not try to hide. Before the ceremony, Benjamin took Clara's hands between his, the same hands roughened by work that he had learned to admire even before knowing her full name, and told her, with a voice charged with an emotion he no longer tried to hide, "I spent years trying to discover who could love a man without money, and I understand that first I needed to learn to deserve the love of a woman like you." Clara, with shining eyes, answered, "And I needed to discover that even the strongest men carry fears no one else sees. You taught me that fortune was never the problem. The problem was the fear of trusting, and that fear between the two of us no longer exists." Lucia, now 8 years old, delivered the rings with a solemn seriousness that made everyone present smile. And when finally Benjamin and Clara said yes before the altar of the small chapel, the entire village of San Geronimo del Valle celebrated as if the wedding belonged to all of them, because in a certain sense, thanks to the school, the workshop, and the community bakery, it did. Clara wore discreetly pinned to the simple dress she herself had sewn for the occasion her mother's silver thimble, converted that afternoon into a small brooch that Anselmo, without anyone asking him, had it set in a fine silver mount by order of Benjamin, as a silent homage to the object that had been witness to the birth of their love. "You didn't have to do this," Clara told Benjamin, touching the transformed thimble with trembling fingers while the ceremony was about to begin. "I wanted what began as an inheritance of sadness and work to also become a memory of all the good that came afterward," he answered, gently kissing her forehead. After the ceremony, the celebration moved to the main plaza of the village, where the same women of the sewing workshop had prepared amid laughter and complicity a simple but abundant banquet. A toll, mole, and a 3-meal cake baked by the new community bakery. The village band played until well into the night, and Dona Herminia, at one moment of the feast, took Clara by the hands and whispered in her ear with eyes full of tears, "Your mother would be proud, daughter. And I am too, as if you were my own blood." Benjamin and Clara danced that night the same waltz they had danced months earlier during the feast of the patron saint, only this time without secrets between them, without any weight hidden under Peon's clothing. Only two people who had each learned, in their own way, that true love needs both surrender and honesty to sustain itself over time. 5 years later, the Hacienda Los Laureles had become a reference throughout the region of Guanajuato, not only for its economic prosperity, but for the model of community work that Clara and Benjamin had built together. Hundreds of widows and single mothers had passed through the sewing workshop, learning a trade that allowed them to support their families with dignity. The rural school, already with 2 full-time teachers, educated more than 100 children of the region, sons and daughters of peons who would never have dreamed of learning to read. Lucia, now 12 years old, grew surrounded by love and by opportunities her mother had never had, studying with the same seriousness with which as a child she had held the reins of a horse under the rein, already determined, as she said with a mischievous smile, to study law someday, so she could defend, as Benjamin had once done, those who had nothing with which to defend themselves. Dona Herminia Salazar, already with completely white hair, continued attending births and curing illnesses in the village, although now she counted on the help of 2 young apprentices she herself had trained. And she used to say, every time someone asked her for the secret of Clara and Benjamin's happiness, that there was no secret at all, only the patience of 2 people willing to rebuild with deeds what a lie, however well-intentioned, had been on the point of breaking. Don Fausto Renneria, for his part, had lost not only the lawsuit and a good part of his legitimate properties, which were seized to cover the fines imposed for the documentary fraud, but also the respect he had once held among the landowners of the region. He moved to the state capital shortly after the scandal, and his name over the years became in the village an example of warning that mothers used to teach their children that greed, sooner or later, always ends by collecting its own price. Anselmo Bravo continued as trusted steward of the hacienda, although with the passage of the years he had also assumed with silent pride the role of godfather to Lucia, whom he patiently taught to ride horseback every Sunday morning, always repeating the same phrase he had told Benjamin so many years earlier, that trust, like freshly baked bread, tastes better the fresher it is, and that he, thank God, had had the fortune of seeing his employer learn that lesson in time. The peons and workers of the hacienda had a phrase they frequently repeated, almost like a popular saying of the region, before Don Benjamin was known for his lands. Now he is remembered for the heart he found in Dona Clara. One spring afternoon, almost identical to the one that had changed their lives forever, Clara and Benjamin walked together among the workers of the hacienda while the sun set over the Sierra de Guanajuato, tinting the sky with the same orange and purple tones that had witnessed the first time their hands brushed over a silver thimble worn by time. Benjamin had once gone out looking, disguised as a peon with nothing, for a woman capable of loving him without knowing his fortune. And what he found instead was something far more valuable. A woman who taught him that a man's true worth never lay in the wealth he accumulates, but in the way he chooses to live, work, and love when he believes no one is watching. Clara, for her part, still kept in a small wooden chest beside the bed, she now shared with Benjamin the silver thimble converted into a brooch, symbol of everything she had had to go through to reach that point in her life. Sometimes on quiet nights, she took it out and turned it between her fingers, remembering her mother, remembering Gregorio, remembering also that storm which, against all odds, had ended by bringing her the most complete happiness she had ever imagined possible. "What are you thinking about?" Benjamin asked her one of those nights, finding her awake with the thimble in her hands. "That sometimes life takes everything from us so that afterward, when we least expect it, it can give us back far more than it had taken," Clara answered, carefully putting away the thimble and resting her head on her husband's shoulder. "Then I suppose we were both lucky that a storm crossed our path." "It wasn't luck, Benjamin. It was that both of us, without knowing it, were ready to recognize the value of what we had in front of us, even if it came disguised in the most unexpected way." And so, amid the daily work of the hacienda, Lucia's laughter running among the workshops and the school, and the quiet certainty of a trust rebuilt with patience, Clara and Benjamin continued writing day by day the simple and true story of two people who learned that the most lasting love is not born of shared wealth, but of the honesty with which one chooses to share every morning the entire life of the other.